Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Distillations podcast happy hour. I'm one of your hosts, Alexis Pedrick, and we're excited to share the wrap of our most recent season with all of you. Now, if you're a longtime listener, you probably know what we do. Distillations podcast explores the funny, the bizarre, and serious stories from the intersection of science, culture, and history. This past season, we covered science at the margins, examining connections between alchemy and public health, the experiences of scientists with disabilities, the mysteries of space junk, and more. And it was a lot of work, and we did it in the middle of a pandemic. So today, we want to toast to an incredible season, give you a peek at some of what goes on behind the scenes, and reveal the glamorous life of podcasting and other science history nerdery. So, before we get started, a few housekeeping details. We're streaming live to YouTube. If you want to ask a question or comment, just sign into your YouTube account and use the chat. You can also email your questions to podcast@sciencehistory.org. And speaking of questions, Sarah Ray and Lisa Ruth Wren from our episodes on monstrous births and space junk will be stopping by the studio to answer questions about their shows. Do you need to know more weird stuff about Peter the Great? I mean, the answer is yes, we all need to know. Or the strangeness of space treaties. So get your questions ready. But for now, we're going to kick things off with the first thing you should know about making a podcast. We do not come out sounding this good on the first try. Words are hard. So here are some bloopers.
Should we keep talking about smutty romance novels, or should we get to it?
His name was... Oh, I'm going to mess this up. If you can say this name 5 times fast, you are probably him.
Oh God!
Oh my God! Okay,
I can do it.
This is what, like take 5?
Take 5. Oh God! I just cracked my neck. All right, let's go. Let's go.
When they drafted their current constitution in 1991, they designated.
Take a second.
I really don't want to say orbit, but it's the funniest word I've ever invented.
Think obituary.
That's very serious.
Yes, obituaries are not funny. They're sometimes.
I'm going to bite my own. Okay. When they drafted their current constitution in 1991, they designated geostationary orbit as part of their sovereignty. Today,
You did it.
You did it!
All right. So
I feel like every blooper reel is everyone laughing as I float off into like a pronunciation space.
words are hard. We said it. So we're back.
Geostationary orbit.
Oh, I can't even say it now. So why don't we all introduce ourselves and tell the folks at home a little bit about what we do on the show so they can have a face to go with the name or I guess in this case, the voice. So I am Alexis Pedrick. Like I said, I am one of the hosts. In my day job at the Science History Institute, I do programming and outreach and education. And then, I follow all the rules of my producers who tell me what to do and give me marching orders.
I'm Lisa Berry Drago. I'm the other. I'm the. You know, they always say the better half. I'm the other half of the co-hosting team. I'm actually also a curator at the Science History Institute Museum. So I develop exhibits here. I create some of the digital exhibits that you might have seen on our website through the Google Arts and Culture. I work on all kinds of digital content, in-person content, tours. You know, in normal times, I give tours and all kinds of museum interactives. I try to work on programs and stuff like that. And I, too, try to follow the lead of the producers.
Speaking of which, the producers.
Hello, I'm Mariel Carr. I'm the senior producer, and along with Rico, we are the people that are scurrying around behind the scenes, pitching, writing, researching, interviewing, telling these guys when they pronounce things wrong, laughing, all that good stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm Rigo Hernandez, and I'm the assistant producer, which basically means that, like Mario said, I have my hand in a lot of pots in the production.
For sure, for sure. So I guess a good place to start is this season we all worked on different stories to varying degrees. So what was your favorite story and why? Tell us about it. What was the one that like we had to pry? I know the ones we had to pry each other away from because we were like, it's time to work on the next thing. You got to let this go. So why don't we start with Lisa?
Sure. So I'm an early modernist, which means I study that period that comes before modernism. I study mostly the 16th, 17th century, and I look a lot at the history of alchemy and really early science and early chemistry, early material science. I like the intersection of alchemy and art a lot. And so earlier this year, I was reviewing a biography of Paracelsus, who's a really famous Swiss physician who comes up with some really. He's an alchemist. He's a really out there guy, but he comes up with some stuff that's really important to the history of medicine. And one of them is this theory about targeted drugs, and that you can. It's not that your body is out of humor. It's not that your whole body needs to be treated with bloodletting and maybe going to a hotter climate or something like that. But that, if you have an illness, you have some specific thing that's wrong in your body, and you should be able to take a specific kind of medicine, like a pill, and treat that one part of your body that's malfunctioning. And that sounds like the most normal thing on planet Earth to us all right now. Like we all have completely absorbed that idea that, targeted medicine, specific illnesses, targeted medicine. But Paracelsus got into a lot of fights and book burnings and all kinds of stuff about that. And so I was reading this book, and it was talking about that he lived for a long time in mining communities because he was really interested in minerals and metals, and as an alchemist and also as a maker of chemical medicine. And it was basically, I was shocked to find out that he kind of created one of the first real public health case studies. Looking at a mining community and realizing that it was working in the mine that was making people sick. And it wasn't like a miasma, some kind of weird, unhealthy air. I mean, it was unhealthy air, but it was actually silica particulate, like breaking down the miners' lungs, creating disease. And he figures this out. He puts it all together. And he actually looks at the community too and says, oh, it's not just miners. It's actually their families. They come home, shake the dust off their clothes, and the family gets sick too. And I was reading this kind of with my head in my hands, thinking that we're living in 2020 and we're still kind of like, how bad a toxic exposure does invoke like OSHA regulations. Paracelsus is sitting back, three centuries ago going, guys, you might want to look at these mines. So I brought this was a really fun one for me because I brought it to the team, and I actually, this was the first script that I'd actually written. That I did like soup to nuts writing on. It was cool for me because I got to see how much work you Mariel and Rigo always do for these things. Like we often go through the story development process together, but the actual writing and the putting together of the structure and the architecture of the story often falls on our producers. So to do it myself gave me a new respect for what you two are always going through with the story. And it was fun. It gave me so much like a feeling of ownership over it. So that was definitely my favorite story. I loved working on it, and it was a totally new like stretch.
We loved it. We could tell you loved it. We could tell. Go ahead.
So when you were talking about how you kind of made an obvious point, which was like, look at the mines. They're like, seems really obvious to me, to us now, but it wasn't obvious to them then. And like that kind of gets to something that one of the big themes of every story, a lot of stories we do, which is how like people in history weren't dumb. Like
Yeah.
So I like that aspect of that story.
Yeah.
Kind of
for
brought
sure.
it home.
We have so much more information at our fingertips, you know,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
now, and to watch people make choices like in real time in the 16th century is a whole other ball game.
But I think we're always trying to find that, right? Like that's always like an angle we're trying to come at from a story. Like you thought it was this, but you thought wrong, my friends. So Rigo, what was the story for you that we had to pry you away from? What was one that you loved working on?
I enjoyed doing the Who Owns Outer Space, and it was the story about a little-known treaty from the 70s known as the Bogota Declaration, which basically was a group of equatorial countries that challenged the Outer Space Treaty, which is a governing document for outer space. And that story was like really about like how do you fight like
Yeah.
the de facto superpowers. And like as it turned, well, like how I got the story was from the work of Lisa Ruth Rand, who we were doing a pre-interview, which is something I do a lot of. I do a lot of the pre-interviews just to kind of see what works and doesn't work. And when she mentioned that, I was immediately drawn to it because it featured Latin American countries, which is not something that I'm used to hearing a lot about in the history of science. So immediately I had it in the back of my mind. And this episode, by the way, almost didn't happen. It just kind of worked that we had a hole, and I had already done all that research.
Yeah.
So then it didn't happen. And what I like about it was that it really made me understand, like it really put in perspective to me how the 1970s were extremely radical in ways, in more ways than the 60s were. Because we talked about the 60s as being this radical time, but actually the 70s were the real like radical time. Like a lot of like a lot of stuff was happening that was just like they were like the 60s were like they announced that they were radical, but the 70s is when the actual radicalness was happening.
Yeah.
So I've always appreciated that made me appreciate it, and also it made me appreciate in a little bit of cynical way how like my conclusion from doing the story was that maybe the most you could do to a superpower is just kind of like annoy them and bother them.
Make them uncomfortable.
Yeah,
make them uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And like that's like an oversimplification. Maybe Lisa Ruth can get into it like in ways in an academic way that I, as not an academic on this, can look at it. But so I really like that for those reasons.
Yeah, no, for sure. This was one of those episodes where like you read the script and like I think there's only so much time. Like you cannot possibly like go down the rabbit hole on every single script. But this was like, and we were, I think, towards the end of our recording, like for the season when we were finally like doing the intros and the outros and things like that. And this was one that I was like, oh dang, I wish I had like actual time to like really go down the rabbit hole on this. Because I kept seeing things that I was like, wait, what? I'm sorry, what? Wait, what happened?
It did. I love this story because of that exact thing, that like poking the superpower aspect of it. And I also love that it almost seems like just a symbolic kind of, you know, like laying claim to the space over your country's sky, your particular region's sky seems like such an empty symbolic thing. But then you remember that like that space is actually getting filled up. Like it seems symbolic, but it's not symbolic. That is a technical and self-directional future like space to negotiate right there. You're like preemptively being like, if you put something up there, you will have to deal with me. Like,
right.
I think the way that I described that story was that it was, I think both, well, maybe not so much the other one, but it was like this, I got really excited that it was this story that was about space that had nothing to do with really the science of it, like the bare minimum. And it had everything to do with just like the politics and the, you know, social justice issues and so many things, like all that stuff.
Why should we treat space as something to just get cut up by superpowers? like
it's-
oh well, they don't have rockets, so they're not entitled to it. Oh, really?
Yeah, because that feels
Forever?
There's
That's
like
our
a de
decision
facto
forever?
monopoly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's like
just
already
because they have the
established.
technology and the money, they can
Yeah.
actually have a monopoly, even though the outer space treaty says space belongs to everyone and no one. But in practice, it actually is just the people who can afford it.
It was a preemptive antitrust.
Yeah.
move.
And also, it made me realize how like outer space is like governed by a series of norms, which is like the honor system, and we're like no longer operating under the honor system is broken. So
That blew my mind. I was like, wait, I'm sorry. There's not like, I mean, because you think about sci-fi and like when you get to sci-fi, it's all like space law. And like,
It's like
now
if
we're
you,
just
if
like,
you go over the border, there will be a laser cannon. On the
yeah.
other side.
And now we're just
That's
like,
not true
it's
for our space.
space norms. so Mariel, same question to you. What was the story for you that like we could not see?
Yeah. Well, I love it that we all had our babies clearly this season.
Yeah.
And it's like we all had our babies, but then I think we also kind of like, I at least fell in love with like different parts, or you know, like the other ones, like felt very attached to different parts of them. But my baby was the science and disability intelligence episode.
Yeah.
That's the one I worked the most closely with. I felt like Colin's story was so amazing. And he was just so open and so eager to tell like his own story. And I was actually talking about his story with my sister this morning because we were just talking about, we were having a conversation. She was like, what's that term? Imposter syndrome? And I was like, let me tell you about imposter syndrome. You know, this guy, like it was just like a really refreshing story that I think all of us feel imposter syndrome, and it's such a universal thing to feel. And here's someone who like on paper is this very, you know, accomplished scientist. He looks the part, and yet it was a very relatable story. And I thought it was so, you know, it was just like really great to get that personal. I did also fall in love with some of the other stories, especially the collecting monstrosity, what we call babies. So I know that's your baby, Alexis.
Don't steal my baby, Mariel.
But I also loved, I have a thing, I love the like, you know, the stories that big issues can be told through a very personal lens, like Colin's. But I also, you know, separately really love bizarre stories that have to do with like macabre things. Like I've written feature stories about mummies and eating mummies, and I've made a short film about taxidermy. And so that one was also like right up my, this is bizarre and weird, a little bit, you know, creepy alley. So
no, same there. It's like exactly the kind of like story I love to tell. I used to work at Laurel Hill Cemetery, so I'm like very comfortable with the macabre. It feels fine to me. And I think also like history is macabre and history is weird. And like that's the thing I loved about this story is that it reminds you that like we kind of order history in this very neat, like, and then this happened, and then this other thing happened, and it happened because of this, and it happened in these orders. But like, in fact, it's just like lots of things hinge on like somebody having a really weird personality, or like just like the right things sort of all coming together at one point. And like, I just like could not stop like reading about Peter the Great. Like I was like, am I the only one who knows this? Does everyone else know like how insane this story is? But yeah, I love that. I mean, you don't have to make stuff up about history because history is already sort of weird enough. And that there are so many things that we kind of take for granted. Like the history of embryology, like on the face of it is like a very straightforward thing. Like we're like, all right, well, there was a history and this is how like babies are developed and we understand it. And like, but when you like wind back that story of how we got there, like that was just like fascinating to me. And I know with Sarah, it started out as like an interview, Rico, that you did, and we just listened to it and we were like, this is the whole story. We have to keep talking about this forever.
I have to add one thing about why I love that, which is that we've spent so much time as a team, like figuring out our process, and like this part happens on this part. And we've been like, well, first you do this and then you get this thing. And we refer to this internally as sort of jokingly, how is Babby formed? Right?
Oh, because you had never, that's right. You had never,
before you kept saying it.
when we started recording this episode, I kept making this joke like, "How is Babby formed?" And Mariel, you kept being like, "What are you
What are you talking about?
talking about?" And I was like,
missed
"You
it.
have
I missed
never
that thing.
seen, you've never read like the Yahoo answers. How is Babby formed? How girl get progrant?"
So I
And you
fell
were
in love
like,
with this whole idea. So
"Oh
that
my
the
god!"
fact that like we were then actually doing a podcast episode about literally how
How is
Babby
Babby-
was born, and then I got to write that line into the script like made my year.
Yeah, I was delighted. I was delighted to show you and to educate you.
We do have so many. Sometimes we come up with these very clever lines, and then we have to sacrifice them at the end. So actually,
Oh, yeah.
getting a joke through, getting a really good joke through, is very satisfying for all of us. So if there's anything that makes you laugh in a script, there was like 20 more things that we
Yes.
said while we were sitting around exactly like this, spinning out all the possibilities that had to get like surgically removed to make sense.
And I think I asked you guys, I was like, do I have to get rid of this? Is this
We
just
were
for
like,
us? You were like, no, you should
no.
keep it.
This is in. This
Sometimes
is
we put
in.
our feet down and we're like, the
No.
line stays.
How is Babby formed must stay. The whole thing
It's
hinges
like
on
our
this.
whole careers have been leading up to this moment.
Leading up to this moment. So okay, so I want to ask y'all a question and maybe share a little behind the scenes because obviously we made this whole season in a pandemic. It's completely different from how we normally make and build podcast episodes, and so do you guys want to share a little bit about like behind the scenes, what it was like working on that? We have some fun images that we all agreed to share from our glamorous life of podcasting from home. I will start because I think, I don't know, my husband's going to be mad, but that's okay. So I am coming to you from my beautiful kitchen office that is all finished and fancy right now. But it did not start out that way. In pandemic times, we kind of had to build it from scratch. So it started like this while we tried to figure it all out. I also had, I had a co-producer. She was very rude. It's constantly... honestly, the worst co-producer I've ever had. Not helpful at all. So my husband is a math teacher, and so he's teaching remotely. And so we have a very small house, and we're sharing the same like super small space. So there would be times where he would be teaching class, and I would be needing to like read and practice scripts, and like you can't really do that full voice while like two people are, one slim wall between them. So this is the very glamorous life of me being out on my back deck, reading out loud to myself, and probably making my neighbors like panic a little bit. Like, what is she doing?
Here's a great big what?
So it was really, really like it was. We at one point, like there were times where like we sent, I think, the audio to the engineer, and he was like, I can hear her refrigerator in the back. Like, can she unplug it? And I'm like, dude, you don't...
refrigerator, and then it was also Lou doing dishes.
It was dishes in the background, and we were just like, it's nothing we can do.
This is pandemic life. You have a shot of me trying to interview a squirrel.
Oh yes.
Just like, losing it a little bit, starting to look around the neighborhood for subjects.
Things starting to break down.
Yeah. I would say I was really excited when we sort of got better equipment, because I was not ready to do like, serious recording at home. So our delightful producer sent me a microphone, and I upped my game. So I had my headphones and my microphone and a room that is mostly muted.
Mm-hmm.
So we made it work. Headphones are important.
Yeah, man. Yes. You had like a very nice pair.
I do actually have a nice pair of headphones. I've always had those. I do not like to hear what's I think referred to as other human beings.
Yeah.
So when I'm in any kind of public space.
I hear you. It's true.
So, and I think you have one more picture, which is
I do.
I spent a lot of my time trying to get out into nature and just like take a lot of long walks outside and bring that like good energy back to the production process.
Legit. For sure, for sure. Mariel, your glamorous work from home.
Yeah, I think you have a picture of my
was-
assistant, my
Yes,
glamorous
your
assistant.
assistant. I
So
mean,
I didn't
better
have
than
child
mine.
care for 3 months. Between mid-March to mid-June, I guess. So it was a lot of like, I think you have another picture of me. Like many scripts were written,
Oh,
in
yes.
front of Winnie the Pooh, things like this. It was very chaotic. And then even when we did get a babysitter, there was like a preschool on the first floor.
Yeah.
And lots of thumping sounds. And I think we did one interview, because we also did a whole separate series besides this season.
Oh, right. Yeah.
During this
Right.
time.
We
And
needed more to
during
give.
one of the interviews, I guess you could like hear my child like screaming the whole time. And you're like, oh, that was so funny that, he was just there. And I was like, oh, I don't even hear it anymore. I'm like, what? Oh.
But also you got a
Oh yeah. So
a
also
dog at
on
this
top
time.
of this, we decided that we should adopt a puppy. So we adopted this puppy on July 26th, and the season came out on August 4th. So
Incredible.
we were nuts. It was not the best timing. But it was
not at all.
my brain is not
I
what
mean,
it
it's
used
in
to be.
there. It's in there. It's in there. We can confirm it's in there. It's in there.
I remember saying that to my husband. He was like, oh, because we had been, applying for like puppies for a long time. I don't know what's time. It was a while, and nothing. We were getting turned down. And then it was like, oh, there's a puppy. Do you want it? And we were like, I guess. And I was like, this is really not good timing. But we were just like, this is the one we're getting. So
it's never good timing.
No,
you just gotta do it.
No, Rigo,
so like, he was like up on my shoulder, and I was doing stuff,
doing what you do. Yeah. It's very, you just like make it work. Rigo, you had like, I want to tell everyone in the like office we work in, there's like, like we have like real storage and like a room where stuff can be, and like all of that had to be sort of like compressed. So like you had like a work from home setup too, right? This is your everything sort of compressed down to like its most small essential parts.
That's usually my field kit that I take, and I record every side of the interview on my end. But actually, that setup didn't work out because it's so close to my face. I ended up like popping a lot, and not only popping, but actually like the levels were so high that the audio wasn't usable.
Yeah.
So actually, how not to do it.
There we go.
But you used that to record some street sounds the other day, right? For that.
So it does kind of all work and all come together. Well, I want to bring on our very special guests to answer a few questions. Lisa, you're going to ask them a few questions. They are now in the studio, so why don't we bring them on? Let's see. I'm going to get out of here because I think, Lisa, you should ask them questions.
Sure. I'll take it away. So everybody, if you have not met our special guests, Lisa Ruth Rand and Sarah Ray, if you have not listened to the episodes, go and do that immediately. No, just kidding. Stick around here and ask them some questions. So both Sarah and Lisa are former fellows at the Science History Institute. They joined us to do some independent research, and then got like roped in to this whole podcast madness process, because we were so we always try to orient ourselves to what the fellows are working on, what the fellows are doing, what people are in the building actually researching, because that's a great source of content for us, and it's something we can get really excited about, because every year there's a fresh crop of fellows bringing these new amazing often lesser known stories to our attention. So we're really grateful to both of you for sharing your research. So why don't you both just go ahead, take turns, and introduce yourselves, just a little bit about what you're working on.
So I'm Sarah Ray. I was a dissertation fellow at the Science History Institute last year, and now I'm seventh year PhD student in the history and sociology of science at Penn. And I'm working on a dissertation on the history of collecting and preserving monstrous births. So that's what I talked to you all about.
And I'm Lisa Ruth Rand. I am a postdoctoral fellow at the Science History Institute, and I am working on my first book, which, as might not be all that surprising, is about space junk, about the history of space junk, and how different communities around the world came to see outer space as a natural environment at risk, rather than this kind of empty void where things just happen when we make them happen.
So my first question is actually for both of you, which is, how does it feel to listen to your episode? So you've turned, something that you've been working on for years and years and years, and you've helped us really condense it into this 30-minute story experience. How does it feel to listen to yourself and listen to your story in this completely new format?
I was very delighted by it. I mean, I thought you all did such a good job with the episode itself. And it was, I think, very nice for me to see this. I'm so used to presenting at conferences and in very academic spaces. It felt really nice to kind of cut loose and be able to just, talk about the material in a way that that felt more intuitive and fun, and really let me engage with this as just a fun story to tell. And it was also, again, sort of being 7 years into the process, it's an extremely useful resource for, friends and family who I think have never quite really known what it is that I do. And so this has been a really nice and useful thing to send them. And people are like, oh, I didn't realize that, you were working on that's a, interesting subject. So it was a nice way to introduce folks, that have been invested in my scholarly progress as sort of an abstract thing, actually welcome them in to the material itself. So yeah, I thought it was a lot of fun.
Awesome.
I'll say that as a listener, I've been fortunate to be aware of Sarah's work for years now, and I've heard her present it many times in different contexts. And it was, she's a remarkable storyteller. So in addition to being a fantastic historian, it was, for me, hearing Sarah's podcast, I also love to be able to, even as a fellow academic, I love being able to hear that side of her skill set, which is just telling amazing stories about little known to the rest of us historical events. For me, I was fortunate. I basically got to have 2 podcasts with Distillations this season, because as Rigo mentioned earlier, we had such a great early conversation that little bit on the Bogota Declaration piqued his interest, and we got to have 2 episodes about outer space and politics and garbage and inequality and resources that so I feel I feel very fortunate that I got to have both of those experiences. I never like to hear my own voice, whether it's on radio or podcasts, but at the same time, this was, like Sarah said, a really great opportunity to just talk about this work in a way that hopefully was a little bit more accessible, and in a way that would resonate with audiences outside of our usual groups that we speak to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's always something that's on our mind, is how we can make these stories really, really rich and in depth and really accessible at the same time. So it's a good, I come from an academic background too, and it's always a good exercise for me. Is there anything that you feel was missing from either of your story? Something that you were just dying to get in there, or really would love to tell people, but just, we didn't have time for it, or it just, it didn't come up, or anything like that?
I don't know. I think what I find really fun about this section of my dissertation that I was, discussing on the episode is that there are just kind of endless rabbit holes and little tendrils, I guess, that go off from it. So it's almost hard for me to identify a single one. I think kind of, we talked on the podcast quite a bit about Raus and his work with, creating anatomical preparations, and his work with the midwives. And in, working on this material for as long as I have, I found that that's the other sort of thread of my work that people tend to be really interested in, is the way in which midwives and mothers really contributed to this science of embryology. So one thing I really love doing is reading just historical, especially 18th century accounts of monstrous births. So really the episode we were talking about the collection of physical bodies, and the preservation of those physical bodies as objects in the museum. And in the in another section of the dissertation, I look at a lot of the stories, like the actual information that mothers and midwives are providing to these anatomists about like the experience of being pregnant. Because of course, like one of the main explanations for bodily abnormality during this time was that the mother had had some adverse experience during pregnancy, like she'd seen a scary goat, or there'd been a crazy comet, or like whatever it might have been, and that is what sort of impressed itself onto the fetus. So one thing I'm really fascinated about, and just kind of love going on another just in-depth tear about, is like how those stories that like when we read them now, we're like, oh, those are kind of crazy and fun, but just sort of incidental contextual stories, how they were actually provided really helpful information to early embryologists in isolating moments of change or moments within a pregnancy that might have produced a monster. So you find that like, even though they're quite invisible from the textual evidence, women actually like contributed quite a lot, both in terms of these material bodies that they were giving to Raus through the midwives, but also in terms of information just about their pregnancy and the sensations and experiences they had during it. So that would have been like there's basically two roads that you can take from Frederick Raus, and we took one, but that's the other one.
That could be a whole other episode.
Yeah, it could be.
And in my case, again, I think because I basically ended up with two, or being featured on two podcasts anyway, I think that we did a pretty great, it was a pretty great encapsulation of the entirety of my book. We didn't leave out a whole lot. But I mean, just stay tuned though. When the book comes out, there will be more details. But I will say that perhaps one thing that we didn't talk about that much was how everyday people experienced space junk from 1957 with the launch of Sputnik on, whether that was Cuban dairy farmers encountering a piece of space junk that fell and supposedly struck a cow in 1960, to foresters in Gabon who claimed that an early satellite system, actually we talked about in the podcast, Project Westford, how they believed that was interfering with their ability to use their radios. We did talk about Skylab and Skylab featuring in beauty pageants, right? So there were all kinds of different interesting stories of just everyday people encountering space junk, either directly through objects that had fallen from orbit into their communities, or anticipated or expected or imagined or real encounters with the effects of a growing quantity of artificial material in outer space. So those are all just really kind of interesting pieces of this history that, and it's a history that typically focuses on experts, right? On engineers, on state leadership, on national leadership, on diplomats, like these kind of very highly specialized roles, where part of what I want to focus on, and I try to focus on in the larger book project, is how people around the world who did not have expertise in any of the traditional aerospace fields did have these encounters with space junk.
That's amazing. I could see an oral history project growing out of that, or something like that. Like I would love to hear more about those individual experiences.
Well, fortunately, there's a group of, I believe they are geographers by training out of Memorial University in Canada, who are, last I spoke with them, they are trying to organize to do an oral history among the Inuit and Dene communities in what we now call Canada, right? Who encountered the debris of the Cosmos 954 crash that we talked about in the podcast. So, which is great, because that's a really important historical archive that needs to be created. And that is something that, again, last I checked, they were working on. So I'm hopeful that will actually happen.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I'm going to ask you a question, actually, really quick. So what is the weirdest piece of space junk you have ever heard of?
The weirdest piece of space junk? That's a hard one, because there's so many. I mean, the weirdest piece. The problem is that space junk, is kind of in the eye of the beholder, whether or not you think it's valuable or whether you think that it's garbage. I mean, there's some that I think we can all agree is garbage. When a satellite falls to Earth and hits a cow, for example, that's a really good one, though. I really like. I mentioned it briefly in the last answer. The Cuban cow incident, when a piece of an American rocket malfunctioned and fell into farmland in Cuba and supposedly hit a cow and killed it, but there was some disagreement on whether the cow lived or died or ever existed in the first place.
Schrodinger's cow.
Yeah, and it became this became central to subsequent anniversary parades for the Cuban Revolution. There was one of the big parades they had. The way that it was described in both diplomatic accounts and newspaper accounts was that peasants had reconstructed the rocket from fragments and paraded it through the streets, calling it the cow eater rocket of the Yankees. And they also, Cuban students from the University of Havana organized a protest following this incident where they marched from the university to the steps of the United States Embassy, and they were joined by a couple of cows and one bull who were wearing protest signs claiming U.S. aggression for sending the piece of this rocket over sovereign Cuban territory. So this was this was the 1960s. This was an early incident of space junk falling where it should not, and causing kind of a pretty big geopolitical incident that's pretty much largely forgotten. In
the revolutionary cow eating rocket is a really good answer for this question.
Yeah, there you go. Good.
So Sarah, you are the story that you told, the monstrous birth story that you told, was one portion of your dissertation. Is there another portion that you're working on now? Sort of give us a teaser of something else that you might be working on, the future Distillations podcast.
So I mean, what I just was talking about a couple minutes ago about maternal minds in midwifery. That's the first chapter of my dissertation. So you can pick me up on that. What I discussed on collecting monstrosity is the second chapter. So I just finished writing up. So basically where the dissertation goes from this point is looking at, now that we have all of these babies in bottles and we have this new developmental paradigm of embryology, how is it that basically you go from this category, this very capricious category of monster, to diagnoses where, the body itself sort of designates what the body should be, how it should be classified by medicine. So the question that I'm interested in is what is the sort of intuitive connection that people often make between the babies in bottles and the modern category of disability, which we talk about a bit in the episode. Mm-hmm. So in this chapter that I just finished writing up, I really dig into this science of teratology and look at an early teratological treatise, and kind of am looking for themes about, what are these themes saying about what it means to have an abnormal body. So it's not just an anatomical designation of cyclopia means you have one eye, but there's all of these themes in there that cyclopia occurs when the fetus is stagnated at the level of fish, or is sort of incompletely evolved towards its state of human. So I'm really interested in how those themes that are really wrapped up in this early science of developmental embryology and teratology get mapped on to the way that medicine then treats people with abnormal bodies that are alive as civic entities, right? So I'm really the whole dissertation is basically trying to get to this question of how did medicine come to have authority over abnormal bodies? How is it that medicine sort of came to have this paternalistic relationship over this category of disability? So this chapter that I just finished writing up is sort of that pivot point where we go from, okay, we were studying fetuses, miscarriage material and fetuses in jars, but how did the science that was done on those bodies get extrapolated onto the bodies of living people through the medium of diagnosis, basically? So that's what, it's kind of my most, I think, heady chapter. It's very, it's a deep dive into this one Dutch book, one Dutch teratological treatise. And then, I kind of go from there and eventually end up deep in the weeds of early 19th century Dutch disability policy, which I think whenever I tell people that that's where the dissertation ends up, they think I'm telling a joke, but I'm not. That is actually where it ends up. So I'm interested basically in how folks, these early teratologists, these early developmental embryologists that do so much work on explaining fetal abnormality and are collecting these fetuses. So, the guy that writes this teratological treatise also has one of the most extensive collections of fetal abnormalities outside of St. Petersburg. He's in Amsterdam. And his sort of authority over being able to, his ability to explain what bodily abnormality means in the context of embryology imbues him with this great scientific authority such that when the Dutch state is like, well, we need to figure out what the state's responsibility is to our disabled or our crippled citizens. He's like the guy that they go to. So I'm really interested then in like how that transition happens between I'm a guy that just collects a bunch of like fetuses in jars to I'm the guy that advises the state on what types of institutions are necessary to care for people who can't work or who are, for whatever reason needing in-home care. So it's kind of like, I don't know, the dissertation is like very, it's a weaving path, but I insist that it does actually make sense. it's up to me to make that
That's
case.
one of the things we found so fascinating about your work is that it really does draw this line between, what's considered a kind of, I don't know, but that sort of that monsterology side of things does in fact, there's a through line right to our contemporary understanding of disability.
Totally,
and it's all based in these kind of, as you say, these hobbyists, these curiosity chasers in some ways. And it's that is fascinating, and it's important to understand that where we got, as we always say, science is a human endeavor here. We're always saying that here, and we're always reinforcing that, the ideas we have currently, our contemporary understandings of things are not immutable. They're not fixed in stone. They haven't existed for 20,000 years. They might have existed for 150 years, but they're changing. Thought is changing and developing all the time. And so to look backwards and say this is what people have believed forever, and then you're confronted with an 18th century idea or a 16th century idea or 14th century idea, and you go, people did not believe this.
Yeah.
So
yeah. I mean, I think that's one reason why I love embryology is because, to us, developmental embryology is like, well, duh, of course, that's like simply the intuit, like, how could it be any other way? And so when I'm teaching this type of, this subject to my students, they're always like, yeah, of course. Like, and then you discover developmental embryology and it makes sense. And I'm like, but it doesn't. Like, if you were in 1770 and someone was like, oh yes, you get a blob of nothing and nothingness, and it just magically becomes a fully developed human being, that like, how on earth do you think that passes the smell test? And it's kind of fun to see them work out that, like, when we look back into embryological history and we see something like preformation, where, the tiny little baby just grows in size, it seems so absurd to us, but it's actually extremely logical given the given the information that they had and the ability to observe that they had. So yeah, I don't know. I think that's one reason why I love this century, is because everything that you think should make very obvious sense was actually like quite insane when you put it back in its proper context. And it always makes it feel a bit like you're living in the upside down.
We might be.
Yeah, we might be.
Thank you both so much. I think we're going to flip this back. To
No,
Alexa.
I'm here with a question from the people.
How exciting.
Listen, I will not let this question go unanswered. This is from John Wentz. He wants to know, do either of you have a favorite archive find that might not have made it into your projects? And our producer, Rigo, actually was just mentioning that we have about a whole hour of CBC clips about Operation Morning Light that didn't make it into the episode. Like, we could do like a whole episode about the crash of Cosmos 949 and the cleanup operation, that's what was called Morning Light. But like, we only spent like 5 minutes of it in the episode, but there's just like a ton of audio we could not use. So what about you guys?
I'll kick it over to Ruth first.
Yeah.
Not to like.
Sure, no problem. So, I mean, that's one of my favorite things about being a historian is, you'll be slogging through sometimes just like piles and piles and piles of information and data in, sometimes poorly lit basement archives. Then suddenly you'll find something, you'll go, what? And, I couldn't make this stuff up. And I think the thing is, I try to include them all. But since I didn't share them all in the podcasts, I will at least share one of my favorites, which was in a letter exchange between astronomers back in 1961. Again, those of you who listen to the podcast, Space Junk podcast, would have heard me talking a bit about Project Westford, which was the subject of one of the first debates about the environmental protection of outer space, what amounts to the environmental protection of outer space. And there was one astronomer who wrote a letter to one of his colleagues who who was very, very upset about what he believed to be not enough attention given to the problem by the United States government, in particular by the U.S. military. And he was calling for astronomers to be a little bit noisier and a little bit more involved and to create a fuss. And he compared, he was worried that they weren't being active enough. And he compared inaction on the issue to Chamberlain's appeasement of Hitler before World War II. Wow. And he prefaced it with, please excuse the trite analogy. It's a bit of a trite analogy. But but it showed that they were taking this very, very seriously, right? This was not, and we're seeing, and one of the reasons why I think it's relevant to bring up that right now is we're seeing this same kind of debate happening right now with the SpaceX's Starlink satellite constellation. You're seeing a lot of the same even rhetoric that astronomers use. I haven't seen Godwin's law come up necessarily in my paths through Twitter about Starlink, but there's still this kind of this is coming up again. This concern about who's the watchdog, right? Who's paying attention to make sure that these new satellite systems are going to be safe for astronomical research. That's one of my favorite ones, and it will get in there, but we didn't have a chance to talk about that when we sat down, Lisa. So, but there's a lot more. I mean, every so often someone will break, right? Yeah. It's when they break. That's kind of the exciting parts of the archival research.
Right. That's cool. Sarah.
And I think mine is like far less relevant. I mean, it's like not relevant at all to current life, but just stuff that I like love reading. And then I'm like, well, I've just spent 3 weeks reading this and it really actually has no place in the entire dissertation. For me, I think, and also I've just been like doing an article revision where I had to like remove all of this because it was like, as one reviewer pointed out, they're like, this is not really like the best source material. And I'm like, I know, but it's very interesting.
I want to keep it.
So like the, 18th century British Scientific Journal Philosophical Transactions is like, God bless their archivists, because it's like all online, every single article you can just go on and like click. It's from like the mid 17th century all the way through. You can just go and be like, I want to read. So basically what I did was I was like, I want to read every single account of a pregnancy ever published in Philosophical Transactions from like the minute that it started getting published in the late 17th century up until about 1800. And so I did. It was extremely depressing couple weeks, because it was just, it was these extremely vivid accounts of pregnancies and birth and a lot of pain. Like very few people make it out of the story like happy or alive or unmaimed, but they were just extraordinary glimpses into lives. And I was doing this sort of in service of researching this chapter on midwifery and maternal experience. And it was just really amazing to me to like look at, like read all of those, and a lot of them were about abnormal births or about monstrous births, and just try and sort out like what women were thinking at the time that like this body was born, and they were sort of having to process it in real time. The role of the midwife and like sort of being the intermediary between this very distressed woman and like this anatomist. It's like, ooh, yeah, like, I want to see more of that. Like her sort of role in managing the whole situation and the way that she was trusted as an authority, I thought was really interesting. So I just like totally went down that rabbit hole and thought it was a fascinating way to just see change over, a century and a half of the way that people understood monstrosity. You see it in these really like sort of oblique ways, because of course no one's sitting there in the birthing chamber being like, here I am simply going to philosophize about the nature of monstrosity as this woman is like, giving birth. Yeah. But it makes its way in there. And so it's really kind of fun to just read those and see the different ways that these relationships change over time and the information changes over time. So those were one thing that like I loved reading. They really helped me, even if they haven't like made it into the dissertation, and certainly not this article, unfortunately. They really helped me figure out how to like reapproach other material and like with new eyes, I think, to like they guided me in like how to look at more relevant primary source material. In a way that helped me draw that information out from Dutch sources. Cool. And then just like a total quip, but like my second, like I think it was my first research trip. I was in London. I was in the Hunterian library, and the Hunterian is like this fantastic anatomical museum over in London. And I was reading John Hunter's papers, and he's a anatomist, and he was describing doing a dissection on a boy with hydrocephaly, which is severe fluid retention in the head. And he's describing the dissection, and like I can't remember like the whole run up, but basically he describes that he drained the head of fluid, and it was 6 pints alehouse measures of fluid. And I'm like,
wait,
what an image. He like kind of was measuring them out in the same way that you would measure like pouring beer from a tap at a bar, which I just thought it's been like 6 years, but that still strikes me every time I see the skeleton of someone with hydrocephaly, or honestly, I'm like at a bar and see a pint glass. I'm like, 6 pints, alehouse measure of fluid in the head. So
as you do.
That's, yeah, I don't know. I was like, John Hunter, you've got to standardize your measurements in a more respectful way.
I'm so delighted by this answer. I hope that I hope, John, that answers your question and you are delighted by it too. Thank you, Sarah, for stopping by and hanging out. So I don't know, Lisa, it's just you and me, but I feel like we should bring our producers back on, and I feel like we should turn the tables on them. That's how I think we should wrap this up.
How the turntables have turned.
Yes,
let's flip it.
Exactly.
Let's flip it.
Yes, I think it's time for Ask a Producer. So it is both of you. It's your turn to be in the hot seat.
Oh.
You're on now. We're gonna ask you. We'll ask you.
Well,
the
ask
question.
away then.
All right. Well, first of all, it's a lot of. I got so aggressive. It didn't need to be that aggressive. I'm sorry. It's a nice question. So, I don't think a lot of people like know kind of like what a producer like does, like what actually like goes into building this podcast. We're used to getting it in our ears that it's already done and it sounds great, and we're just like we kind of take it for granted that all those pieces come together. But like, how is podcast formed?
How is Babby formed?
All right, how's Babby formed? How's
podcast well, I guess I'll start. It's everything for like you hear the episodes, you see the season, but like those all grew from ideas that maybe Rico had walking down the street one day, that he decided he wanted to know more about this thing, or that's just one example. But everything from like the idea of a show to who's the person we interview for it, what's the, what books do we need to read? Like we do all of that research, the reporting. Most of the time we're writing the script, although this season was different, and both Lisa and Alexis took their turn writing scripts. Lisa wrote the Paracelsus, what was it actually called? We have like our internal names for the episodes, and then I can't remember.
Sorry, I just remember Paracelsus right now.
I only remember
the occupational health one. Monstrous
it was
birth.
Paracelsus and public health for
collecting
so long.
Monstrosity. Alex was sort of Alexis's baby from the beginning, but Rico and I are the ones who are, for the most part, actually doing the interviews. So every once in a while, you'll hear us on tape and we're asking a question. But the way that we usually edit it, it sounds like they've just sort of appeared, and maybe you're imagining that Lisa or Alexis interviewed them. But very often, it's us interviewing people. Kind of like structuring the shows, finding the archival elements, actually editing it and putting it together. It's all the glamorous life of a producer.
For sure.
I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Rico.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say to you.
No, it's accurate. What I usually do is I look at the fellows, because we get a list of fellows every year, and then I go through the list, and then I start Googling them, and then I sit down with them, and then usually I go to their lectures or I listen to their lectures, and then I figured out which part of that is gonna work. Because I've had it where I talk, the idea is great, but then you talk, but then you talk to the fellow, and the fellow is not, they say they're game, but they're not game.
Right.
And that's rarely, but sometimes it happens.
I mean, interviewing is hard. I don't think people know that. Like, it sounds like it's so easy and so straightforward, but it's not.
Yeah.
Well, and as academics, we're also trained not to speak casually or to think of what were our research as stories. You know, I think I think in a lot of places, some places it's changing, but in a lot of ways, we're still trained to be like, well, no, actually, I can't say this because factually and technically, there's these 13 other layers to it, all of which I must explain. And it's like, it's really hard. It's hard not to do that because that's our training. That's what we have to do in a lot of other formats. But in this format, you have to find,
I didn't mean it as like a shade at them. But you can just tell because they'll be like, that's not what I'm trying to say. Because what we're trying to do is create like a narrative or a message or something. And that goes against their training. Like
and sometimes you something that makes a great dissertation does not make a great cocktail party story.
Yeah,
right.
But like there's fantastic research out there that, you know, like that there's research that I've done that sometimes I'm like, you know what? Nobody needs to hear about this. It's fine, actually.
Yeah. And I think part of what we're doing is making it accessible and sort of like simplifying things. But I think the more exciting part of what we're doing, or at least trying to do, is like finding and then highlighting like the joy or the like bizarre or like the thing that really gets you going that you would be excited to tell someone either at a cocktail party or your taxi driver, right? So
the thing you're really passionate about shines through when you're speaking. I mean Rigo, I feel like when you do those initial interviews, sometimes like a little box will unlock and something will start pouring out of somebody, and I feel like it's like, there it is. There's the story.
And it happens in like things that you don't expect. Like I remember when I got assigned to do Rare Earths, which is another season. But I remember thinking, how can I possibly care about the bottom 6, 7, 8 elements of the periodic table? And then they turn out to be fucking. I mean, sorry, they turn out to be amazing.
And like some things, you know, they're amazing. Like when we just heard Sarah Ray describing her research in that first meeting, we were like, okay, this is clearly an episode just talking about those weird people that like stuck babies in jars. Like that's obviously interesting, but sometimes also things are interesting.
Sometimes like Rare Earths, you got to dig for the story.
There you go.
I'll see myself out.
So you, I think people don't often get to see sort of the like technical side of this. And so Marilyn, Rigo, I know you're going to tell us a little bit about kind of how we actually get this magic. And we have a sample, right, from the program we used to do it. So wait, let's see if I can work my magic. Aha! Here we are.
All right. So
the back end.
Okay, so this is I'm not gonna like get too deep into the weeds here or nerd out too much, but this is software that we use called Descript that, like, you know, they advertise it as a word processor with a play button. So like this is like, if I'm scrolling down, do you see me scrolling?
Yeah.
Okay. So we, you know, for each episode, we're recording a bunch of interviews. We're going to find this one I think actually does not have archival elements in it, but we basically like dump everything in here. And then you can see here, you know, I was that kid that like had 6 different colored highlighters in school and had like my little categories for things. And that is basically what I'm still doing here as a grown up in these scripts. So, you know, just like highlighting the interviews, I'll play you a little piece of it.
My name is Colin Dietrich, and I'm a scientist at the University of Pittsburgh. I'm an immunologist.
And so like it all starts here. It's kind of like an organized chaos, sometimes more chaos than organized.
So what was happening before the script was that we were editing on paper, but we should be editing with sound because the final product is not paper, it's sound.
Yeah. And this has really helped with our read through. So we can have a script and then we can open it up here and, you know, Alexis and Lisa can read their narration that has not been recorded yet. We're still sort of writing it or tweaking it, but like we're listening to the tape around it. And
because one of the things you guys taught us really was to be thinking about, I mean, because we used to sort of read through and we would see the written line on the page and we would say, and then we would read our line after the written line. But one of the things that I feel like I really learned from the two of you is that the tone is important. So the way that the person is saying the line, the way that their emotion is showing through, should really impact the way that you are reading your lines around it, the way that your framing narration is coming out, and learning that was really interesting, and it really was made a lot easier when we started listening to the clips during the read-throughs.
Yeah. for sure.
I think the reason why I like the Colin Diedrich clip, but also that story, was because it very heavily features a graduate student, which is like, I would say it's their bread and butter. Is like, and it was a story for them, about them. So it was kind of cool that way. That's kind of like it's kind of our built-in audience. Like I mean, at least I spend so much time emailing graduate students, like a lot.
Yeah.
And that actually makes me think of another sort of behind the scenes thing, which is that we often do multiple interviews with people. And I've talked to other people, or maybe we've talked about this in like presentations before. Like you could just like expect to call someone up for a second time. I mean, maybe you don't always, but like very often you're in that, you're editing the audio, you're scripting, and you're like, oh, he didn't really, now I realize I need this thing. And he didn't really talk about it that much. And I don't know, maybe you're supposed to like, maybe there's an ideal world where like you get all that the first time and like, okay, maybe that's possible. But ideally you have someone that's like, oh yeah, that was great. Like you were nice. I can talk to you again. And like, you go back and you like dig into the stuff that you want more of. Like for example, with that Colin interview, I realized I didn't have him, like, I really wanted that moment and what it felt like when he was in the middle of failing his comprehensive exam. So I was like, I'm going to call you back up so you can tell me this really painful story again in more detail.
Yes.
And he was very gracious and did it. So
I have a question that comes right off of that for both of you, which is, what makes a good interview for you? Yeah. How do you know when you have like the interview? It's happening.
Yeah.
Well, I think what I just said is one example for me. Like for example, Colin felt like, I felt like he was reliving that moment, and he was like there, like he was telling me this story, but like his emotions, he was like reliving that experience and like remembering the sort of visceral like painfulness of it. He could laugh about it, but like, he remembered little details, like, and he was sharing those. So
I remember you sending, like, we were listening to the tape, and I was like, oh, I could just listen to him talk. Just tell me the whole story. I don't even. I'll hear him forever. Like so it was.
There are two kinds of interview people that we have, and that's like the character and the big hat that we call him the big hat. So the character is like the person who's living through it. That's a Colin. And then there's like the big head who kind of contextualizes what the episode is. And I feel like what makes the medium so important and so like interesting is that you're looking for honesty, and that's what you're looking like. Any honest moment that you like, that felt real, that felt like legitimate, that felt like something you can just feel it, that it's honest. You're looking for honesty in the character. I feel like I'm actually not as good on the character side, but I'm actually better at the big hat expert side.
Yeah,
I feel like I'm better at interviewing. And what makes those interviews good is like reading their stuff. Like it sounds so simple, but like I read Kim Nielsen's book twice, just to make sure that I understood the book. Like just to make sure that like I actually like got what she was trying to say. And the interviews just drag on for so long because they're like, we're riffing off each other. Like it feels more natural, more conversational. And that's for someone who wrote this book, and they can tell when you read their stuff.
Right.
And when you do that, you're not just like having them repeat the information. You're getting like 1,000-foot view that they have from like really thinking about this topic for a long time. And I think we got that from, like, for example, from Jessica Martucci too. Like she wasn't just like repeating things that she wrote in whatever she had written, but it was like really like probably what she kind of like fell asleep thinking about at night, having thought and done so many of that, those interviews herself.
Sure, for sure. I mean, that is, I think, there are many things where you joke and you say, oh, it takes a village, but like, like really a podcast episode takes a village, both to like make, but just from the people who give you their time and their expertise and open up their brains and just kind of say like, okay, well, come in here and scoop out what you need. And like, that is what allows us to be able to tell stories. I mean, so I think, before we I think we should toast to number one, all those people who interviewed with us, who spent many, 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 many hours talking to us, sharing information, doing all the things that helped us build the season and make it possible. We are so incredibly grateful to them. And we are hard at work on the next season. I shall not reveal what it is, but we're already working on it. But we do have something to kind of tide us over. I don't know, Lisa, if you want to talk about it for a little bit, tell people what to be on the lookout for.
Yeah, definitely. So this is a project that comes. It's a joint project between the museum and the Distillations team, and it's called Between Us and Catastrophe. This is based on the work of a Philadelphia area photographer, Kyle Cassidy. His works, you're taking a look at his images right now. They're really beautiful portraits of Philadelphia's essential workers. So everyone from doctors and nurses who are conducting tests and taking care of patients on COVID ward, to Instacart delivery people, caviar delivery people, mask makers, sanitation workers, literally everyone who is keeping society running and keeping us all alive in this time. So the people who are, this is where the title comes from. So these are the people who are literally standing between us and catastrophe. And for us, it's, you're probably thinking, that's great. That's to give a thumbs up to essential workers, but you're a science history museum, and we, as we always say here, I think I said it already, science is a human endeavor.
Yep.
These are science stories. A mask maker is engaged in a science story. A sanitation worker is part of the science story. An Instacart delivery driver is part of our science story. All of this is a science, technology, and medicine story. That this is a historic moment unfolding in real time, and we're all part of it and all living through it. So this is going to be an exhibit of large-scale, life-size photography that's going to be on the facade of our building. So it will be an all-outdoor exhibit.
Yeah.
Social distancing encouraged, no building to go in. You can stand outside and enjoy it. And it's going to have an audio guide produced by this amazing team that includes interviews with the photographer, Kyle Cassidy, and interviews with the portrait subjects. So you'll be able to hear their stories in their own voices. And it's Distillations doing what we try to do best, which is, tell an urgent story, give voice to people, really put them in front of you and let their stories and experiences speak for themselves in some ways. So look forward to that. That will be coming in the next few weeks.
Yes.
We're hard at work at launching it right now. So I'm excited to share it with everybody.
Yeah, so stay tuned. So we're busy with thank you all. You'll hear us soon. You'll see us soon. Come by and see what we're working on.
And I just want to say, if you are not local,
yes,
still listen to the audio guide and see the images online. So you could still.
Oh yeah.
It'll be set up
You cannot come in person. Enjoy it from the web. The photos and the audio guide will be available at Science History, on our website, sciencehistory.org/pandemic.
Yes. All right. Wonderful.
Be well, everybody.
Be well. Thank you all.
Episodes again.
Bye.
Bye.